Today, the central theme is the financial system in transition, and we begin our activities with a lecture with the title Financial Stability and Development and Sustainable Development, which will be delivered by Vice Director of the Bank for International Settlements, Luiz Awazu Pereira. Luiz Awazu Pereira, you are most welcome. It is an honor to begin today's activities with your presentation. Those of you in our audience, please feel free to formulate questions over the chat because we will have time to answer questions. Mr. Luiz Awazu Pereira, the floor is yours. Thank you, Adalgisa. Good morning to all of you. I would like to thank the Forum of Development for the invitation, and Sérgio Guzmão, President of ABDE, the invitation to talk about financial stability and sustainable development. I'm going to talk about the financial system in transition, challenges and solutions, with a special focus on the role of central banks. As a preface to my presentation, I'd like to highlight that development institutions are key instruments to address market failures and imperfections, such as unpriced negative externalities, also to enhance coordination and cooperation with other agents, and thirdly, to facilitate public policies that are equitable from a social point of view. So these banks are instruments that can contribute to overcoming tragedies of the horizon of the commons and also contributing to investments under uncertainty. But they still need to contribute to keeping macroeconomic and financial stability. I will try to illustrate this through three major concrete cases under climate change and COVID-19 conditions. So first, I will address new challenges for stability from climate change perspective to new financial technologies to reduce inequality. And thirdly, the issue of post-COVID recovery, which will need to be more sustainable. And I believe yesterday and the day before, this was brought up in the discussions. And so the first topic is climate change and a possible role for central banks. I'd say that today, it's not so much about knowing whether it is necessary for central banks to help combat climate change. It's more about how, not why. So there's been a very positive evolution of mindsets among the central bank community based on Mark Carney's work and Stern, as well as the Network for Green in the financial system, which is part of the perspective of the Brazilian Central Bank. And so this change of mindset, it requires a certain degree of humbleness. Central banks, they understand that they need to play an active role, but they are not saviors ultimately. They will not solve climate change problems fully. And so the actions of several other players are necessary, such as governments and private sector. And this can be done within the mandates, the current mandates of central banks, because climate change has a direct impact on the mandates for financial stability and price stability and macroeconomic stability of central banks, because we do know basically that climate change events such as huge storms, etc., they have an impact on the losses of banks and insurance, and this ultimately has a negative impact on global financial stability. And of course, several other stakeholders of the financial sector and private sector are moving in the same direction. So the contribution that the Bank for International Settlement has given to this topic is to show through this book published last year, which is available on our website, that we have coined these catastrophic climate events green swan. And so moving away from a more ethical perspective towards a more risk-based perspective. So a risk approach, so showing that we need to change the paradigm of risk models that we used to have in the past, moving away from the normal Gaussian distributions and seeking more complex models that are not simply linear or mere extrapolation of past data, historical data, because in our understanding, this green or the green swan are very different from the black swan, the so-called black swan. They are certain to occur, and there are inflection points, tipping points, after which non-controllable events affecting the temperature of the planet can generate very negative effects for a global economy. And so we face radical uncertainty. But in spite of this radical uncertainty, we advocate that we need to move and pursue a reduction. You're certainly aware of this graph measuring our GHGs, annual GHGs, but we need to move from this growth trend that we have currently to reduce to close to zero. Otherwise, we run the risk of facing the kind of situation illustrated in this graph. You can see in red the zones where if the temperature of the planet rises above the threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius above the average for the industrial era, we will have vast areas of the planet becoming completely uninhabitable for the population in general, generating migration movements and catastrophic effects for the population. And so climate change is very, very likely to unchain macroeconomic and financial events that are extremely devastating for the planet. In addition, from a risk point of view, there are events connected to climate change, just showing some events, potential events here, such as the change in circulation of jet stream currents in the Atlantic, and what we know of the impact on tropical rainforests, and events in the polar caps in the south and the north. These are all events with cascading effects that are completely unknown by current science, even though we may predict that they will have extremely devastating ramifications. For all these reasons, the central banks are beginning to show an interest. Well, they began in the 90s and more so after the 2000s. And the central bank in Brazil also has been showing an interest and doing its part, playing its role in interfering and doing something against climate change.
And I do not mean do everything, doing things that are within the mandate of these institutions. For example, supply of modeling instruments on climate risk, on modeling the resilience of the economic sector. They are more complicated, but they are necessary. For example, thinking about the macro models, the role of the regulation on financial stability on the perspective of climate risk. Another example, the accounting standards, the way we register climate risk on financial institutions' balances. And one other example is the taxonomy on green investment products, for example, both for private and public investors. So these are tasks of central banks taking into account the need for coordination with other players. That is, it is not about doing things isolatedly, but climate change is a global phenomenon and it requires coordination among local and global agents. For example, obviously, ministries of finance and governments, they are actually the first ones responsible for fiscal and tax tools in order to correct these distortions, these negative externalities. And here we know we are at the development forum, so we know we also have to coordinate with international development institutions, but also national institutions, development banks at the national level, as they have the tools to finance the transition. And this needs to be done by using new technologies, new financial technologies, not only for financing transition, but also something important. I believe this transition needs to be done with a degree of reducing inequality. So climate change is a phenomenon that hits more profoundly poorer countries, and inside each country, the poorer segments of the population. So we need to take into account poverty and inequality. And the new technologies in the financial sector can actually bring more inclusion and change in the way that we are designing public policy. Certainly, you know that through fintechs for faster payments at lower costs, for example, the use of our smartphones, we can contribute quite a lot with financial inclusion, and we can use several means: digital identity, big data, artificial intelligence. All these can change the speed of payments and also the accuracy of targeting policies, improving the earmarking capabilities. And this is very important for development banks, which need to use this type of tool. Obviously, we need to be careful and also look at some risks involved in these technologies. They are indeed inclusive, but they may cause some kind of digital discrimination through eventual ways that algorithms are used. I will show you one example of a country such as India. Through digital identities, they accelerated their banking inclusion. Here shown in the vertical axis, the percentage of the population with bank accounts, and the per capita GDP on the horizontal. So the time for countries such as India to reach this level of banking inclusion has been highly accelerated with these technologies. So it would have taken much longer without these technologies. And this is also true for technologies for fast payments. And Brazil has been developing these fast payments. So the ability for having faster bank transfers and with smaller amounts. Also, the reduction for the prices of remittances. And this also facilitates the lives of poorer people. This also needs to be done. And these technologies that can address inclusion or financial inclusion, they can and should be used. This is the third point, in the way that we design our post-COVID recovery. And what is the role of institutions, of development banks? This is a very simplified chart of a possible post-COVID recovery. GDP on the black line, and we know it is not an actual V form. It is more like a square root, but where we are now, and for us to go back to the pre-COVID trend, if we use traditional technologies, we can see a recovery in yellow. Initially faster, but less sustainable in terms of development. Or if we use more sustainable technologies, we can see in this dotted green line. Maybe because they are new, they sometimes may take longer to materialize, but they are more sustainable and they bring more benefit to society. The point is, by using these new technologies and development banks, fiscal policy, and aid and research aid policies, these financing may make this green line be even more accelerated than the traditional recovery. I believe this is the point that some researchers, such as Stern and Stiglitz, are using. And they show this in this graph. It is a bit more complicated, but I'll try and explain. In each point, the graph measures the ability of having positive impact over climate, measured vis-a-vis its fiscal multiplier for the long term. So the more you are at the northeast quadrant, the greater your positive climate impact, i.e., the more you are contributing to climate change, and greater it is the multiplying effect in your economy. And you can see in this graph that some programs are quite interesting here in terms of post-COVID recovery programs, such as infrastructure, research on alternative energy sources, So in order for us to move in this full green line and sustainable line, there are several policies that can be addressed, and the role of development banks is essential, is crucial for us to liaise this logic between post-COVID recovery with a sustainable approach. And you discussed this yesterday. I could hear some of the presentations. We started to look at the types of more sustainable infrastructure that can be financed by development banks. And I believe and I think that you heard what happened in the One Finance Summit in the Coalition for Development Banks. And this was the topic, using the recovery for sustainable development. And it is not only related to public banks, but partnerships with the private sector, as the private sector also has a lot of appetite towards having green financial instruments, and it needs a bit more precision and direction about the taxonomy of such green instruments and how they can be mobilized to indeed increase the market of this type of assets.
And obviously, the private sector is also seeking partnerships with the public sector. We have examples that are quite concrete of such initiatives. You are sure to have heard or even discussed several of the coalitions that are seeking zero emissions. From the point of view of some asset managers or even major companies in the private sector, projects for decarbonization of the portfolios of major banks and insurance companies. And of course, we mustn't forget two major initiatives underway: the European Green Deal, a package of almost €1 trillion, one of the main strategies for recovery. And you know that in the new Biden administration, they have a very important infrastructure and sustainable recovery plan for its economy. So the conclusion is, based on awareness raising of the community of central banks and the public and private financial sectors and governments, I believe we are undergoing a very important reflection, and we do need a certain degree of optimism. I know it's very difficult in a volatile and complex world, but COVID, in a certain sense, has produced a kind of accelerated image of what might be a permanent climate catastrophe for all of us. In a certain way, it has brought us an accelerated movie or film but of what might happen, but it has created some certain macroeconomic conditions and an awareness in the private sector that it is indeed necessary to finance a transition that needs to be more sustainable. It is beneficial for a large set of stakeholders in society. It's about coordination and acceptance of a new modality of growth, and actions need to be carried out on the demand side and the supply side. So today, consumers are more selective. Consumers want to consume in a new way. Obviously, we know that, well, there are certain wishes from scientists and researchers. We cannot impose these wishes on the whole of society, but there is capacity for obtaining more information on what are the benefits for the whole of society, and on the demand side, to consume more with more awareness. On the supply side, that's the role of the authorities, of the public sector, to supply and offer products and research, finance new technologies. This is very important, and we need to keep in mind the image of a Schumpeterian creativity with a transition towards new technologies and new modes of organizing society. And we need to mobilize the private and public financing capacity. And the development banks are a key instrument in this transition. And final word is that we need to be aware that a transition towards a less carbon-intensive economy has redistributive consequences. It's a transition that has impacts on the more vulnerable populations in poorer countries that don't necessarily have resources to adapt quickly to this kind of transition. So every time we think of transition policies and we think of financing this transition, and every time we use to this end the public policies issued by public authorities, we must be fully aware of the need to support this transition with policies aimed at social protection and redistribution. Thank you.